Hello everyone, this is Patrick, and I hope you're doing well today. We'll be back in the book of Romans, chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. This chapter focuses on Abraham's faith and the importance that the faith has for the Christian. As usual, I'll give a little bit of history and background before we begin. So who was Abraham? Abraham's story is found in the book of Genesis, and he is a very important figure for several reasons. He was born Abram, which means the father is exalted, but then was personally selected by God to be the father of many nations, which is precisely what Abraham means. Also, Abraham is the first step towards your and my path to redemption. It is through Abraham that we get Isaac and Jacob. Jacob's later named Israel, and from Israel we get the 12 tribes. Following down this lineage, we then get to Jesus, and ultimately the cross and resurrection. But very importantly, Abraham was faithful and trusted God. None of the blessings happen without this faith in God instead of himself, as we will discuss. With all this in mind, let's get into Romans chapter 4, verses 13 through 16. For the sake of purposes, I've split it into 2 slides just because it would be easier for you to read. First, verses 13 through 15. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be the heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if it is the adherents of the law who are to be heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. And now verse 16. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. And it continues on into verse 17. After reading this, I have several thoughts on the passage. First, let's look at verse 13. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be the heir to the world did not come through the law, but righteousness of faith. What this tells us is that Abraham did nothing to deserve the promise. He wasn't perfect, and he was full of sin just like any other person. What did make him stand out was that he knew God had the power to act and would follow through on his promise of an offspring. Following this thought leads me to my second point. What makes Abraham's faith special is that it lasted for years from the promise to fulfillment. Abraham was 80 when God made the promise, and he was in his 100th year when the promise was fulfilled, and he had his son. It's hard to wrap our minds about what will happen in 20 years. For all the high schoolers and middle schoolers listening, you weren't around 20 years ago. For any of the adults listening, just think back to where you were 20 years ago if you want. A lot has changed, hasn't it? However, over that same length of time, Abraham trusted God would come through, and that is why his faith is counted as righteousness. Now, thirdly and briefly, let's look at verse 15. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. This does not mean by faith we can do whatever we want, but rather that we are not justified by works. Rather, we're justified by something else, by faith through grace. Now we reach my fourth point. I believe that verse 16 can be used for Christians and non-Christians alike, but in separate ways. First, for the non-Christians. You can only be saved by grace, and it depends on faith. You and I could never earn it, no matter how good of a person we are. We can never save ourselves. We have to believe that the only way to be saved is through faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. Now for Christians, we share Abraham's faith in God and are the recipient of his divine blessings. God is on our side and always working. He will always keep his promises, and we need to believe that. And now we reach my last point. Why did God wait 20 years? Quite frankly, I don't know why God waited that long. I bet Abraham would have preferred 10 years, or 5, or a year, a few months, or even the following day. Some of us are waiting for God's promises now, and I can't imagine what that may feel like. But I do know this. God is faithful. He may not step in today or tomorrow, but I know that he will. We have to remember that, just like Abraham did. I wish I could tell you when and precisely why God is waiting, but I can't. That said, We must be faithful because He will step in when it's the perfect time. He is sovereign, in control, and will never forget about you. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you have a wonderful day. God bless.